Hello and welcome to this webathon session on functional safety for management and the importance of functional safety management that comes into play. I'm Dr. Steve Gandy and I want to talk to you about why functional safety management is so important. So if the company comes under the COMA requirements or the OSHA requirements here in the US, then the company is expected to follow what's known as RAGAGAP, Recognized and Generally Accepted Good Engineering Practice. OSHA recognizes the IEC 61511 and the ISA 61511 as being RAGAGAP. So RAGAGAP is allowing us to follow best practice, if you like. So the purpose of this is to ensure that problems of the past haven't been recreated when it comes to the safety instrumented system. So basically IEC 61511 is based around a safety life cycle, and there are three phases. There's an analysis phase, a design and implementation, and an operation and maintenance. So it's important that we understand the requirements of each of these phases. As I said, we want to try and avoid some of the problems of the past. We want to provide a consistent framework for us to be able to identify and, of course, mitigate risks posed by the operations and the process. IEC 61511 is a performance-based standard as well as being a risk-based standard. So a performance-based standard says this is what you have to do, but how you do it is entirely up to you as long as you can measure your performance, as opposed to a prescriptive standard that will say this is what you have to do and this is how you do it. You have no leeway, no choice. You have to follow it if you're going to be compliant with that particular prescriptive standard. So we want to be able to identify and mitigate the risks posed by our process, and therefore we need to have some targets, some tolerable risk targets that need to be identified. It gives us the ability to achieve an optimum design by following the life cycle. So it's a balancing. We balance out. Initially at the front end there might be some increased costs because we're spending more time and doing the analysis. But at the back end we will gain because we'll have potentially less downtime, less problems, less potential for incidents, near misses and so on. So it does actually balance out at the end of the day. And it gives us a means for being consistent, and being consistent is very important. So if we look at the life cycle, as I said, there are the three phases: the analysis phase, the design and implementation, and the operation and maintenance. And what you'll see to the left side of this particular diagram is something defined as the management of functional safety as well as the planning. So I like to characterize things fairly simply, and the way I characterize functional safety management is the glue that holds it all together. So if we don't follow functional safety management, then we could become unstuck quite quickly, and therefore it's very important, and it covers the entire life cycle. Those of us that have been in engineering are familiar with the 20-20-20 rule: 20 weeks in design, 20 months in implementation, 20 years in operation. So we will be spending the majority of the lifetime of the safety instrumented system in the operation and maintenance phase, which means we can do all the things right at the front end. We can do the risk analysis, we can define what our safety instrumented system needs in terms of safety instrumented functions and the target SIL levels that they have to achieve to reduce and mitigate the risk. And we can do all of that correctly and design it, implement it, we're great. But if we don't do the operation and maintenance side properly, then very quickly our performance will degrade. The planning aspect is very important because we need to be able to define a plan for how we're going to maintain functional safety for the safety instrumented system. So this is a very important part of the overall life cycle. And again, the primary purpose is to help us build safer systems that don't suffer from some of the problems we've had in the past. And it's interesting because a lot of the times when I talk to companies, they think that this is an unnecessary overhead. It costs so much money. But again, yes, it may cost you at the front end, but if it saves you at the back end because you're not going to be in a position where you could potentially have some serious incidences. And dear old Trevor Kletz, who's sadly no longer with us, is known as the grandfather of safety. He used to say, if you think safety is expensive, try an accident. Accidents can be very costly, not just in terms of the equipment costs or the downtime, the lost revenue, but also if there are fatalities and if there are releases. So there can be all sorts of litigation and fines that could be levied. So we want to be able to build more cost-effective systems that match the design with the risk. Again, it's this balance, and eliminate weak link designs that don't really give us much but could potentially cost us a lot of money. So the objectives when it comes to the safety life cycle and functional safety management is to help us avoid systematic faults. And we'll talk a little more about systematic faults further on down the line. It's also to help us with reducing the potential for random faults. And the reason why we are interested in the systematic side is insidious because things can be designed in badly or not designed in at all. And this can lead us to have hidden, latent failures that can pop up later on and really cause us to have problems. And some of you may be very, very familiar with the HSE, the Health and Safety Executive Study that was done in 1995. And what they did is they looked at accidents involving control systems and safety systems, and what they concluded was that 44% of all the accidents was the primary cause was bad specification. So here again, if the specification is bad, of course the design and implementation is not going to be any better. But also, if we look at the back end, if we look at what happens during installation and commissioning, and also operation and maintenance, you can see there's another 40-odd% that's due to that. And these are all of systematic failures. So again, we have to be very careful when we come to looking at how we design things, how we specify things, how we maintain the installation. All of that has to be looked at carefully. So functional safety management will help us with minimizing the possibility of introducing systematic failures. It governs the whole life cycle, as I said, and it requires us to allocate life cycle responsibilities. In the 2016 edition of 1511, when it was updated, the standard now puts a lot more emphasis on roles and responsibilities and competencies. As we shall see, this is a significant part of trying to manage and avoid the introduction of systematic failures coming into the life cycle. So we need to specify the activities of those who are responsible with procedures. We need to be able to track and make sure that the competency is maintained, that people are trained, and so on. So we need to have records for doing that. And the whole purpose of this, as I've said, is to help us to manage the risk of systematic failures down to an acceptable level. So the idea is that we can spot them quickly enough and we can fix it if we spot them. If we don't do this, then as we get further down the life cycle, it will become more expensive to fix these particular problems. So there are two types. There's the systematic type, but there's also cybersecurity. So cybersecurity was another thing that was introduced in the 2016 edition of 1511. That was clause 8.2.4 that says we need to do a cybersecurity risk assessment on our safety instrumented system, and it steers us towards the 62443 standard, the IEC 62443, and the TR 8409. The reason being is that if you think about cybersecurity, this could be the mother of all common cause, because if our basic process control system can be compromised, then the possibility is that the safety instrumented system could be compromised. And in both cases, if we don't have intrusion detection systems or a means to identify when we've been compromised, we could be sitting there thinking we're fine, but actually we have been compromised until such time as the virus or the malware actually kicks in, and then all of a sudden we find now that we've lost control of the controls of the basic process control system and the safety instrumented system has been disabled. Then we can be in serious trouble. And there have been instances where operators have been sitting at their consoles and all of a sudden they see their cursors moving on their own and start to click on valves. So this has happened, and we have to be vigilant about cybersecurity. So again, these are the two things. Systematic failures, the definition in the standard is it's a failure coming from a direct cause which can be only eliminated by a change in the design, the manufacturing process, operational procedures, documentation, and other relevant factors. The other relevant factors are the people, making sure people are properly trained and competent to do the work that's been assigned to them. So again, systematic failures can be reduced by good functional safety management. And yet when I go and talk to many end users, they don't really understand what the functional safety management is all about. And of course, when it comes to functional safety, it's different from the process safety, because of course process safety is looking at the releases, fires, explosions, etc. But functional safety should be focusing on the equipment under control, and in particular the safety instrumented system. So it's important that we understand the role that functional safety plays in the development of the safety instrumented system, because that's what we're relying on as our automatic protection layer when everything else from the BPCS has failed. Managing systematic failures. So there are three elements that come into play. It's what we call the 3 Ps. The 3 Ps are people. Are our people properly trained and competent to do the work? Do they have defined roles and responsibilities? Do they know where their responsibilities begin and end? Because otherwise we can have gaps, and we all know what happens when there are gaps. Things can fall through the cracks. The second one is procedures. Do we have written procedures that are being followed? So again, there's no point having a procedure that isn't being followed. Either the procedure's wrong, in which case it needs to be modified, or we have to enforce the fact that the procedure needs to be followed. So there needs to be administrative controls to make sure that happens. There have been instances of accidents that have occurred, and the classic one, of course, is the BP Texas City in 2005, where they violated their startup procedure, as well as not having a qualified supervisor on hand. So procedures are very important. The third P is paperwork. Do we have a paper trail to prove that we're doing what we said we would do, and we can show? So the 3 Ps are fundamentally what comes down to the systematic side of things. And we can apply the same redundancy to this as we would do to equipment. For example, if we have a safety critical piece of equipment that needs careful attention when it comes to testing and calibration, then we might decide that we want a 4 eyes policy. So for example, if the procedure says that the instrument tech goes out, he calibrates it, this is the procedure, then after he's finished doing that, either a senior or a colleague who's suitably qualified and competent goes and checks. That way, if he's made a mistake, it can be spotted and it can be corrected before there's a real problem. So this is the whole purpose of making sure that we have good functional safety management in place. So here again, when I talk to a lot of companies, they basically say, well, this is going to cost a fortune. Where do we start? And taking a pragmatic view is to say, well, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can leverage your existing managed quality system. So if you have a managed quality system in place, then we can use that and we can identify where the gaps are in the quality system and identify the procedures that need to be put in place to address that. So putting in the right procedures in place is very important. Looking at the existing quality system, identifying where the gaps are, creating procedures to fill those gaps. So typically when we go and talk to a client, the first thing we recommend is a gap assessment. So you can go in, you look at what's there, you see where the gaps are, report with recommendations, and then we can create a roadmap and how does the client want to address those gaps, in what time frame and what priority order. So that gives you a 2-for-1 because now you've got visibility. You've also got the means to go back to management for budgeting. And again, it can be tied into the availability of the personnel. It's also very handy if an auditor turns up because you can say, well, this is what we're doing and this is where we are. So you can point to that. So that's the whole purpose. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. We want to leverage what's in place. And of course, with any system, we plan, execute, modify, audit, and improve, of course. Some of the key issues with functional safety management is culture. Culture is a very important part of this because culture comes from the top management. If top management isn't committed to implementing safety and functional safety, and the safety culture is not there, it's going to be very difficult for the people trying to implement the procedures and implement the safety life cycle when there's no support from above. It'll be like pushing on a rope. So the company culture is extremely important for functional safety to be effective and to be practical. So part of this is planning. We need to create a functional safety management plan. The plan is to define how are we going to implement and achieve functional safety throughout the life cycle. Remember, not just at the front end, it's throughout the whole life cycle. We need to define those roles and responsibilities. We need to be able to record personnel competency, even as simple as using a RACI chart, for example. And then, of course, documentation and documentation control is very important. That's our third P in our 3 Ps, paperwork. Doing functional safety verification and assessments is very important. Here again, the standard identifies 5 functional safety assessments that we need to do, and usually companies will just do maybe 1 or possibly 2. And again, I shall talk a little more about that further on in this presentation. We need to document our procedures and processes so everybody has a good understanding of what is required of them in terms of their role and their responsibility. The components of a functional safety management plan. So here, what we need to do, of course, first and foremost, roles and responsibility. There was tremendous emphasis put in the new standard on defining roles and responsibilities, managing competence, and making sure people are competent because of that systematic issue that can come into play. So we need to have documentation structure in place. We need to have defined verification for each of the tasks, for each step, so that we can make sure we're keeping to what we said we were going to do. The development for the safety requirement specification. Here again, from the functional safety management planning point of view, if the safety requirements specification or the SRS is going to be outsourced, then we need to define that, and we need to define the controls so that when we get it back, how do we know it's what we want? And this is where performing a functional safety assessment at that point, the first one, is the way to go. Having design guidelines and methods is very, very important as well, because when it comes to the application programming, from the safety instrumented system point of view, we talk about the application program that goes inside the logic solver or logic solvers. And so it's important to make sure that the language we use for developing the application program meets the requirements. And IEC 61511 identifies 3 language types, and the one that we can use for doing the application program is what's known as limited variability language. Now, most of the logic solver manufacturers will provide tools for being able to create the application, either using ladder or using function block or using sequential function chart, or maybe even all 3. Those are the languages we should be using. The standard defines the language called full variability language. This is where we're looking at embedded software. This would be used by the manufacturer. It would be using a high-level language, such as Visual C++, Visual Basic, C, etc. If that language is used, they have to follow IEC 61508-3 requirements for the software development for that particular SIL requirement. So it's very important that the application programmers don't use full variability language, or if they have to use that, they need to follow the requirements of 1508. So the easiest thing is to stick with the languages offered by the logic solver manufacturer and make sure that we design using either ladder, function block, or sequential function chart. Verification and validation plans need to be included as well. How are we going to test? How are we going to prove what we have is what we need? And ultimately, as part of the pre-startup work, we do the final validation. So we look at the as designed, installed and commissioned safety instrumented system and its safety instrumented functions to make sure it meets all of the requirements of the SRS. This is very important. Then, of course, we need operation and maintenance procedures and guidelines, because, as I said, we're going to be spending the majority of our time in the life cycle in operations and maintenance. Management of change procedures are very important. We have to make sure that changes are properly managed, and then how we're going to do functional safety assessments. It needs to be performed by an independent person or persons or body that is not involved in the design. And typically, the easiest way is to use an independent third party that's qualified to do the work. But some of the bigger companies may have internal resources that are independent enough to be able to perform that, as long as they're competent. When it comes to roles and responsibilities, this needs to be properly defined and communicated. It's no good having an organization chart with Fred down as the SIS engineer when Fred hasn't got a clue what that means and what's required. We need to make sure it covers each phase of the life cycle and any associated activities within that phase. And it's one of the primary things that's noted now for functional safety management. Documentation objectives as well. What do we need to document? Well, basically, each phase of the life cycle needs to be properly documented. How we're managing functional safety is also very important. Our verification and validation, we need to make sure we have evidence that we did the testing and it worked. And if we had failures, the remedial action that was taken following management of change, of course. And then, of course, the documentation for functional safety assessments and audits. The other thing to remember, which is a good way, is the 4 R's. So we want to have the right data in the right format, in the right time, in the right place. And this is very important. There's an example that I can give that happened to the company I was working for about 20 years ago, where we were developing a new safety controls product and we wanted to use injection molding plastics, which was fairly new at that time. We had an existing product that was still very relevant from a technological point of view, but it looked dated because it had been designed in the late 70s. So we thought we could try the plastics out, give this existing product, which was still very relevant, a facelift and a new lease of life. So we commissioned a design house to come up with some designs for the enclosures. We selected a company in California, as it happened, that could do the manufacturing, and we commissioned this to be done. What happened was, when we got all the plastic back and we started to put the existing hardware into the plastic, and we started to put them into chassis in a cabinet. When we got to the last slot, the module wouldn't fit, and we couldn't figure out why, and we contacted the designer. He checked all the dimensions and he said, no, there's nothing wrong with that. Well, the thing that we forgot was that the UK used metric, but the US used imperial, and that the plastics manufacturer had used a program to convert. And of course, there was a small rounding error that basically added up to the point where we were slightly, and thousandths of an inch, slightly too big. So we had to literally get files out to file the sides of the plastic so we could get the last modules in the slot. So that's an example of making sure we understand we have the data in the right format. When it comes to the functional safety assessments now, the purpose of a functional safety assessment, and the key word here is independent. It needs to be an independent, and it's a diverse cross-check of the safety life cycle work to help us identify and correct any potential systematic failures. So does the safety system meet the SRS and actually achieve the functional safety we desire? Here again, when it comes to the team for doing a functional safety assessment, we need at least one senior person who's competent and has the experience to be able to do it, but they're not involved in the actual design team. And this is true for stages 1, 2, and 3, or not involved in the operation and maintenance of the safety instrumented system for stages 4 and 5. So we'll talk a little bit about that. The standard can be a little bit confusing as to how it's interpreted, and here is an extract from the standard which says that a functional safety assessment needs to be carried out after the analysis phase has been done, and then the second one should be done after the design has been done, usually as part of FAT, factory acceptance test, before we get to the stage 3. Now, the way it's worded, it says that whatever stage we do, we need to look at the previous stage to see if there are any recommendations and if those recommendations have been implemented. So again, the standard talks about the mandatory FSA being FSA 3, but this wording would tend to suggest that we should also do FSA 1 and 2. Remember, Functional Safety Assessment 3 is the one that we do prior to startup. It's usually part of the pre-startup safety review, the PSSR. So again, if that's the first one we're doing and we find issues and problems, let's say that we find a problem with the way that the hazard and risk assessment was done, or that we've misidentified the safety instrumented functions, or worse still, we've missed some scenarios for the hazards. This means we won't be able to start up. But if we do choose to start up, then again, if the company isn't self-insured, they better check with the insurance companies, because insurance companies are obviously now paying more attention to what companies are doing with regard to functional safety and mitigating risks, because we know statistically that most accidents occur during startup or maintenance. So startup can be particularly hazardous. So the 5 FSAs that are defined should be considered, and they're there for a reason. They're there to help us find potential systematic issues. Remember, 44% of accidents were attributed to poor design specification. So if we haven't done our analysis phase correctly, then we need to find that as soon as possible, and that's where the stage 1 FSA comes into play. So we can see if it was done correctly, and we have what we need up to that point for our initial SRS. The stage 2 is when we do what I call stage 1 validation, where we bring the application program together with the logic solver, and we do it on a shop floor in a controlled environment. So this would be the stage 2 to make sure, do we have what we need up to that point? Does the application program perform the functions required for each of the SIFs in the time that they're supposed to perform prior to going to site? Obviously, we don't have all the field equipment when we do the factory acceptance test, so there'll be some simulation and emulation going on. In the old days, we used to use lamps and switches, and that's how we used to do it. So functional safety assessment 2 is also important to do. And then the 3, as I said, is the final one we do before starting up. The standard now requires us to do an FSA 4. So it uses the word, after experience and operation, we need to do a performance review. So again, doesn't tell you how soon you need to do it, but you could potentially use the 5-year window between the revalidations of the hazard and risk to gather enough information that you can use to feed into the revalidation. Because this is a performance-based standard, we need to be able to measure it. How do we know if we're achieving or continuing to achieve the level of risk reduction and mitigation unless we have the means to measure? So it means we have to identify some key performance indicators, some of which will come directly from the SRS, such as the proof test intervals. Are we sticking to the proof test interval requirements? The mean time to restore, are we able to maintain that? And the spurious trip. Have we had any spurious trips? Have we had any near misses? Have we had any demands, real or otherwise? So all of these metrics can be pulled and we can track that. And then, as I say, the assumptions that were originally made on initiating events and the frequencies, when we come to do the revalidation, we might find that maybe our estimates were overly conservative. Because again, when we do a hazard and risk assessment, especially if we use the HAZOP methodology, the hazard and operability study, it's highly qualitative and can be subjective. So, the 5th one, stage 5 FSA, should be done when we have any changes, because we should do a safety impact analysis to see what is the impact of this change in terms of safety. And again, it needs to be looked at by somebody who is competent, responsible, and qualified to do the work. So what is this thing, competency? I actually prefer the definition in 1508. I think it's a pretty good one. People often say to me, what's competency? And in my view, it's a blend of knowledge, experience, and capability. But from 1508 point of view, they define it as all persons involved in any overall electrical, electronic, programmable electronic system or software lifecycle activity, including activities for verification, management of functional safety assessment, shall have appropriate competence, i.e. training, knowledge, experience, and qualifications relevant to the specific duties that they have to perform. I think that's a pretty good definition. In the 2003, the first edition of 1511, all it used to say was persons, departments, or organizations involved in SIS safety lifecycle activities shall be competent to carry out the activities for which they are accountable. So that's fairly woolly and open to all sorts of interpretation. In the 2016 edition, they did tighten it up a bit. But basically, as a minimum, we should be looking at and addressing the following. Making sure that we have competency documented, making sure that that covers not just individuals, but covers departments or units involved in the safety instrumented system safety lifecycle activities. So this will be engineering knowledge, for example, training and experience appropriate to the process application, engineering knowledge, training and experience appropriate to the application's technology used. So again, if it's electrical, electronic or programmable electronics. So this needs to be considered. Also, engineering knowledge, training and experience appropriate to the sensors and the final elements. So usually there's instrumentation, there's automation, and some companies have automation engineers that include the instrumentation engineers. Others might use different ones. Others may even have contractors to do that coming in. But again, they have to have the right knowledge, they have to have the right experience, and again, capability. Also, knowledge of the legal and regulatory functional safety requirements. So from a manager's point of view or a supervisor's point of view, it's very important to have that understanding. Because again, if a manager decides to cut cost to not follow the maintenance requirements or mechanical integrity, and there's an accident as a result of those cost cuts, then they could be held potentially liable themselves. So having that understanding and knowledge is very important. So adequate management and leadership skills appropriate to their role in the safety life cycle. So again, depends on whether they're a supervisor or manager. And understanding of the consequences of an event. So this is very important too. The SIL of the SIF. So again, the safety integrity level of the safety instrumented function, because that tells us how much risk reduction we're relying on, plus what the level of performance of that SIF will need to be. And all of that is captured in the safety requirement specification. The novelty and complexity of the application and the technology. As I mentioned to you at the beginning, because 1511 is a performance-based standard, it doesn't tell us what or how we need to do certain things. So we can use technology to our advantage, as long as the people that are using the technology understand. So in the 2016 edition, it now defines that we need a procedure in place to manage the competence of all those involved in the SIS life cycle. And then it talks about doing periodic, it uses the term periodic, again, doesn't define what that is, it's down to the end user, but we need to do periodic assessments on the competency of the individuals and the activities they are performing, and on changing of any individual role. So we need to have that ongoing. So you might say, well, we'll do it once a year. Again, the standard doesn't tell you how to do it. You could do it a number of ways. You could do it through testing, you could do it through observation on the job, or you could have some learning management system that they have to go through. When it comes to functional safety management, we also not only have to do assessments, we need to do audits, and the audits are different from the assessment. The purpose of the functional safety audit is to ensure that the functional safety management system in place is current and it's being followed. So it comes to our third P with paperwork. Do we have evidence that we're doing what we said we were going to do and we're following our procedures, etc.? If we identify deviations and discrepancies, the standard now requires us to highlight and correct those in a timely fashion. So again, it doesn't specify what that time period needs to be. So we need to make sure that audits are conducted by independent and competent person or persons. You can use third parties, as I've said, or you could use in-house if they're independent enough and unbiased. So procedures need to be in place for auditing, and then we define the frequencies of the audits. We're not told how often we need to do it, but we do need to do it. There was a case where a new plant manager came into one installation, and he, off his own decision, decided we'll do a functional safety audit. And they were horrified to find that one of their SIFs had been in bypass for 18 months, and nobody realized it had been left in bypass. So bypassing is something else now that's covered in great detail in the standard. We now have to have a bypass log. We have to authorize bypasses. They have to be signed off when the work's finished and the bypass is removed. There needs to be procedures in place. Operations needs to know what has to happen during bypass. Because of course, if we put the safety instrumented function in bypass, it's effectively got a PFD of 1 because it's not available to do its function. And in some cases, depending upon the amount of protection that safety instrumented function is offering, we may have to have some alternative mitigation in place during bypass. So these are things that have to be considered now. We also need to define the degree of independence that's required from either the SIS designers or from the operation and maintenance side, and define the recording and follow-up activities, especially if we find non-compliance. So again, if there's a non-compliance, who's responsible for ensuring that that non-compliance is followed through and corrected? So that would be part of roles and responsibilities. So functional safety management, as I said, is a vital part of ensuring that our safety instrumented system will perform at its optimum level for the duration of its lifetime. So just to sum up, IEC 61511 defines that functional safety management system needs to be in place to manage the functional safety activities for the safety instrumented system throughout its life cycle. People, procedures and processes need to be covered by any functional safety management system. We need to ensure that we protect as far as possible. Again, there's no such thing as zero risk. There's always going to be some element, but if we can reduce the potential systematic failures to a minimum level, as long as it meets our tolerable risk, we're in good shape. So performing the assessments, performing the audits, following through on what we need to do is all very important. So functional safety assessments and audits need to be done. And as I said, functional safety assessments are there to help us. So why would we not do them? And most companies I speak to haven't really done an FSA 1. Some have done FSA 2. I even had one company that came to us 18 months after they'd started up to ask us to do an FSA 3. So really, that's a bit, there goes the horse, let's just close the gate now. That's not the way to do it. And so we have to make sure that we followed that, because, as I've said, those 3 Ps need to be managed. The people, we need to make sure we have training and that they're competent to do the work. We need to have well-defined procedures that are being followed, and we need to have a paper trail to prove that we're doing what we said we were going to do. So roles and responsibilities, keep coming back to that. That needs to be defined so that people are aware of what they're supposed to be doing. And then we can train them to be able to do what they're supposed to be doing. Use of tools and checklists is very important. I'm a great exponent of checklists. My model is the commercial pilot. Commercial pilots may have flown thousands of hours, but every time they get into the cockpit, first thing they do, go through their pre-flight safety checklist. They don't rely on this. They go through this checklist. Again, consistency, making sure they have a consistent approach. So well-trained and competent people are key to ensuring functional safety management will work and be effective. Deficiencies and gaps need to be highlighted. So the other thing, coming back to culture, is that we want to develop and nurture an open and learning environment. We don't want people afraid to speak up if they see something wrong, or if they find that there's a deficiency in a procedure. They should be encouraged to come forward and identify that. So that's also very important. And you can use independent third parties to help with doing the audits and the assessments. Don't have to, but that proves the independence. There's no problem with doing that. Well, I hope you found this interesting, and I wish you the best. And again, if you have any questions, please let me know. Either ask me directly or you can email me. I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you for listening. Enjoy the rest of the webathon.